So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. So I'll start right away. We were having trouble with the internet, so if it starts failing, let us know. But fingers crossed. So the Bible that most of us know today, one fairly small and compact volume that includes the whole scriptural canon from Genesis to the Apocalypse, with the text arranged for easy reading and reference, was a new phenomenon created in the 13th century. To properly understand this new Bible, one needs to know what came before. So today, this afternoon, or from morning for me, I'm going to start by looking at one example of a 13th century Bible, then look at a few 12th century examples, and then go back to the 13th century to finish. Trying to focus on how changes in format and presentation of the scriptures reflected changes in how the Bible was used and read. I should note that by saying the Bible, it means many things to different people. I'm talking today about the Christian Latin Bible of the Western Middle Ages in the translation that we know as the Vulgate, which is terminology that's only 16th century but commonly used today, dating back in part to St. Jerome, who translated the Hebrew Bible known to him into Latin, and who translated or perhaps revised the Gospels from the Greek. So to begin, our first example from St. Peter's in Ghent is a Bible that was written and illuminated in Paris in the second quarter to middle of the 13th century. If all of you, as a thought experiment, just picture a Bible in your mind, apart from the language of this Bible, which is in Latin, of course, this Bible comes probably quite close to the Bible you're imagining. Here's the opening folio with Jerome's general prologue depicting a monk, presumably Jerome, writing. So we're going to begin and talk a little bit about the most important characteristics of this particular Bible. So first, it's a pandect. It includes the entire Christian canon in one volume. So biblical scholars following Cassiodorus, the 6th century thinker, call these one-volume Bibles pandects, from the Greek meaning all receiving, or from the Latin encyclopedia, a book that contains everything. Secondly, it is portable. It's remarkably small, even if a somewhat thick volume. It has 558 folios and measures only 150 by 100 millimeters. I should say I'm going to use a lot of dimensions because size is really important. And unfortunately, although images tell us so many things, they don't really tell us size. So you have to bring out your ruler or try to imagine. Right now, the slide shows a different manuscript, also an example of a very small Bible, because the digitization included a picture of the binding and what the book looks like. So it gives you, I think, a little better idea of how small but rather chunky these Bibles are. Portable Bibles or pocket Bibles, people call them both things, were small enough that someone could easily carry them around in your pocket, or a medieval pocket, which is a little different than ours, or satchel. Scholars have generally considered Bibles like this as measuring less than 200 millimeters in height. Chiara Ruzzier, whose new study of pocket Bibles was just published in 2022, and I highly recommend it, defines it as height plus width less than 380. A little bit less useful, but the same idea, same sort of approximate dimension. This slide shows another example. Oops, this slide shows you the parchment the Bible is copied on. So the third characteristic is that it's copied on very thin parchment. So parchment, in case anybody doesn't know, especially prepared animal skins, this particular parchment is particularly fine and thin. They're extraordinarily fine. Many modern Bibles, if those of you who still use books, many modern Bibles are printed on what is called Bible paper, or was called Bible paper. But you can see from this picture, it's kind of the same thing. Different materials, but the same crucial properties. The Bible is a very long text, and making each page very thin is key to condensing it all into one volume. This type of parchment did not exist until around the end of the 1220s, around 1230, and it made this new sort of revolutionary format possible. There are examples of small Bibles earlier in the Middle Ages, but they're copied on very different type of parchment and are rather different objects. So the order of the biblical books. Beginning with Genesis, including with the Apocalypse, you can see it listed there. For those of you who are familiar with the order of the modern Bible, this is the same order, except for the position of Acts in the New Testament, which is placed after the Pauline epistles instead of right after the Gospels. And then layout, another characteristic. If you open the book, you'll find that the text is arranged for easy reading, as I said at the beginning, and reference. Here it's presented in 2 columns with visual cues indicating the beginning of each book of the Bible and running titles at the top in red and blue that show you which book you're in. So here in the slide, it's the book of Daniel. Here's the beginning of the prologue with a less prominent initial. Here's the beginning of the book, which is a wonderful picture of Daniel and his lions. And then here's the running titles that says abbreviate the name of the book in red and blue. This book, though I haven't unfortunately seen it in person, is very easy to navigate as a virtual object, and I'm sure it's easy to navigate in person because it hasn't been trimmed. If you are working with one that a modern Bible has trimmed off all the margins and including the running titles, it's very, very hard to know where you are, and that makes a big difference. And finally, oops, that's the wrong slide. Let's see, go forward. There we go. Finally, the book is divided into numbered chapters. You can see the beginnings here and here. They're numbered in red and blue Roman numerals. These chapters are more or less the same chapters that you have in your modern Bible today. As we shall see, not all of these features are new in the 13th century, but it is striking how enduring the organization, how all these features kind of come together in Bibles in the 13th century, and that organization and physical appearance of the Bible proved to be extremely enduring. The 13th century Bible was the direct ancestor of the first printed Bible. Here you see a picture of the Bible we've been talking about, paired with one example of the Gutenberg Bible printed in circa 1455 in Mainz. I hope you can see the rather striking overall similarity of how the page is put together. These books are actually, and this is important, extremely different because the Gutenberg Bible is a nice, big folio-sized book, whereas this book is very tiny, but in the reproduction you can't tell that. 2 additional features of the Paris Bible we're looking at quickly, and other 13th century Bibles to keep in mind. The Psalms in most 13th century Bibles are distinguished from the other biblical books by their layout. They lack running titles. You can see at the time that hasn't been trimmed. It was never present. And they're unnumbered. The Psalms, which were essential for both public liturgical worship and private devotion, were often memorized and were known by their opening lines rather than their opening words rather than by numbers. The Psalms were one of the biblical books that were often copied independently in separate volumes, apart from the remainder of the Bible, and it's not uncommon for 13th century Bibles to omit the Psalms. So if you see a Bible and there's no Psalms, it's not because they disappeared, but it's because it was never there. Secondly, following the Apocalypse in this Bible, so at the end of the scriptures, is a text we call the Interpretations of Hebrew Names. It's a glossary that explains the meaning of the Hebrew names in the Bible. This version, which is completely alphabetical, starts in A, goes all the way through to Z, and rather unusual thing in the Middle Ages. Alphabetical order was not always adopted. This version is the one that becomes almost standard in 13th century Bibles after circa 1230. So this particular text is not one that followed through to the modern Bible, but many modern Bibles do have glossaries, maps, aids to the reader at the end of the edition. So in that sense, the 13th century Bible, even there, is establishing a tradition. To appreciate the significance of this Bible and other Bibles like it, we need to look at the big picture. So like modern Bibles, Bibles in the 13th century were, for the first time in the Middle Ages, usually Pandects. That is, as we said, they contain the Old and New Testament in one volume. 13th century Bibles, like modern Bibles, varied in size, but many were very small. And finally, and arguably, I would say the most important, Bibles in the 13th century were copied in really significant numbers. There are lots and lots of surviving 13th century Bibles. How many? That's a very good question. So Kira Rutzier, going back to the person who studies portable Bibles I just mentioned, has suggested that as many as 2,500, think of that, 2,500 13th century Bibles are extant today, of which she says about 1,200 of them are portable in format. 2,500 manuscripts of any kind in the Middle Ages is an astonishing number. Her numbers are based on searching catalogs and other resources like that. She didn't go out and see physically 2,500 Bibles, but even if the number is not exact, it gives you an idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about, and it's quite astonishing. So the first time in the Middle Ages, because of all those Bibles, the Bible became a book that was used by individuals, ranging from students and masters of the new and rapidly growing universities to the bishops and priests of a church that was emphasizing pastoral care as never before. These new Bibles were particularly suited to the wandering preachers of the Franciscan and Dominican orders, who are 13th century orders, and there's ample evidence of ownership by both of them. Many, many of them own Bibles like this. Here's an example of one Dominican Bible. I included it because it shows you sort of the other end of production. This is not a professional Parisian Bible, but this is kind of a very little funky handmade looking book owned by Dominicans. And although the language of the Bible, it's in Latin, meant its use and study was primarily the province of the clergy, the existence of many finely illuminated copies suggests that the Bible was also owned and treasured by wealthy members of the nobility and the urban elite. Here, for example, to choose a high-end example, is a Bible that is traditionally said to have been owned by Saint Louis, King of France, and he may well have done. The evidence is, it's likely. It later belonged to Jean-Duc de Berry, so this is a very illustrious manuscript. It's quite tiny but very fine. It measures only 155 by 100 millimeters, so it's a little tiny thing. But I should add, just so you get the idea, in the correct idea, by individuals, I don't mean everybody. I mean a small section of the elite. You had to be literate and you had to have a certain financial backing. Any small Bible, whether it's a sort of handmade, homemade looking one like the one from Portugal, or a very expensive one like this one, was expensive. They were the materials that were required and the time it took to copy them just ensure that these were not inexpensive manuscripts and in any way. So to appreciate how innovative this Bible is, let's look back briefly at Bibles in the 12th century. Perhaps the most famous type of 12th century Bible were the very large Bibles copied from monastic houses, primarily to use for liturgical readings and for readings in the refectory. In terms of format, these couldn't be more different than 13th century pocket Bibles. Many are very, very large, multi-volume books. How large? So this example, which I include, I like to show this one because it shows people in the picture. They're gathered around a 9th century Bible, now in the British Museum. a British library, which measures about 495 by 380 millimeters, comparable in size to many 12th century examples, although this book is complete in one volume. 12th century Bibles could be even larger. To pick a famous one, again, because I could find a picture with someone's hands to give you an idea of scale. The Winchester Bible, now in Winchester Cathedral, which was written and illuminated around 1150, 1175. It's one of the very largest and most splendid of monastic Bibles from the 12th century. It measures 583 by 396 millimeters. It's now bound in 4 volumes, although originally it probably had 2. This is Genesis. And then just to give you, oops, let's skip right over it. Just to give you an idea of its beautiful illumination, very famous, which we're not going to talk about, but there's 2 initials from it. Cistercian examples are plentiful and are particularly relevant here, given the importance of Cistercian manuscripts in the Mmmonk corpus. Here's the Clairvaux Bible. It's now a 5-volume Bible, which many Cistercian Bibles were in the 12th century, copied around 1155 or 1165. It measures 490 by 345 millimeters. And you can see here the characteristic monochromatic Cistercian non-figurative decoration here. The Foigny Bible, another Cistercian house near Laon. This is a little bit later, maybe circa 1170 to 1180. Also was originally 5 volumes, although only 4 survive, and kind of a little bit bigger, 518 approximately by 370 millimeters. It's quite a splendid Bible. I find it really interesting that there are no illuminated 12th century Bibles of this type comparable in the Mmmonk corpus. But 12th century biblical manuscripts do survive from both Terduinen and Terdeurst. And Terdeurst had a very grand 13th century large Bible, which we'll see. So the 2 early biblical manuscripts that belong to Terdeurst are excellent correctives to the tendency when studying Bibles and other medieval manuscripts, I would say, to concentrate on flashy illuminated examples. Many medieval Bibles, however, never had illumination and are just as important as objects and for their texts. The first volume of this Bible has 211 folios and 410. It measures 410 by 290 millimeters. It includes the Octateuch, meaning like beginning with Genesis through Ruth, followed by Chronicles. It's very early 12th century or even late 11th century. Here we see the beginning of Genesis. It's really an interesting book. It's quite simple. The rubrics, the headings that tell you what's going on in the page are here often in text ink, even though rubric means red. Or highlighted in red. There are very simple initials at the beginning of the books. Can think of the I at the beginning of the Winchester Bible and how grand it is. And then here we have just a simple little I in sort of text ink at the beginning of Genesis. Many of the running titles are trimmed away, but when they are present, they are often in text ink. They may have been added. Sometimes it's hard to tell just using a reproduction. Here we see Ruth. At the very beginning, you see at the very top there's the running title in text ink and a very simple initial there. There are holes, there are parchment repairs, but even given the simplicity of the book, it is a monumental and very usable book. If we go back for a second to Genesis, you'll notice that there are chapters here, and they are numbered in very small Roman numerals. A little hard to see, but there they are. This manuscript begins with a summary of office readings for the year, copied as a prose text. And the text itself is marked, whoops, wrong one, next one, marked for liturgical readings. If you look really carefully in Genesis, that small number here, number Roman numeral 2 between the columns, very easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And in the next column over, there's a 3. These are numbering the lections for the divine office. So we'll go back to liturgical use often in this conversation. Here's a second manuscript, which comes from, so we'll start with the, it's there. Where am I? Apologies. Okay, there we go. I wanted to show you this briefly. It comes from almost, it's contemporary, possibly not by the same scribe. It's almost the same dimensions. And I suspect these 2 manuscripts represent 2 volumes of a multi-volume Bible, although it's just possible they could have been 2 independent volumes of Bibles made at the same time. Ten Dunen also owned a 12th century Bible or biblical manuscript if it wasn't complete. In this case, somewhat later, from the last quarter of the 12th century. It's quite large and also fairly unadorned, but you can see it's a little bit different. It's got some color. It's rather handsome looking. I mentioned that the chapters in the 13th century Bible we started with are the same as the chapters that we use today. That's not true in 12th century Bibles. So each book of the Bible, or most of the books of the Bible, begin with lists that summarize the book. We call them usually capitula lists, chapter lists, and often numbered, but not always. And then the texts are divided into chapters that correspond with the summary, at least in theory. Sometimes not on, maybe even often. Sometimes you'll find a book where the scribes have copied a chapter list from one tradition, but the text of the actual book is divided into different chapters because the exemplar came from a different tradition. What that a fair number of different types of chapter divisions existed, so there was no assurance that the chapters in your Bible would be the same as those in a Bible in a neighboring monastery, or even in another Bible within your own monastery. Here, if you see, look down there, the beginning of chapter 2 of Kings is the same as chapter 119 in modern chapters. These are what I would call older chapters, just for convenience. Biblical chapters from much of the Middle Ages were used as aids to reading and to understanding the text. The practice of identifying scriptural citations by book and chapter number, the primary use of chapters today, only begins in the middle of the 12th century and only really takes off in the 13th century. We'll come back to that point. Alongside complete copies of the Bible in one or mostly many volumes, a second and very important category of Bibles in the 12th century, and indeed throughout the Middle Ages, were manuscripts that included only part of the biblical text. Know why it keeps on skipping pages. Gospel books and Psalters were particularly important examples of part Bibles, but other books of the Bible or groups of related books were copied and used independently. For example, you would just have the Octateuch, you might just have the books of Kings or the Pauline epistles, etc. This is a very venerable 9th century gospel book from St. Bavos in Ghent. Here are the canon tables. It must be a lovely, lovely book. The canon tables are beautiful. And here is the beginning of Matthew, just to show you. The other crucially important 12th century book is the Gloss Bible. And this is a large and important topic. And sadly, I'm just going to talk about it for a second today, but very important. The texts that we now know as the Glossa Ordinaria were assembled over many decades of the 12th century, beginning at the Cathedral School of Laon at the beginning of the century and then continuing in Paris. As you can see here, I hope, this in the middle, the text in larger script is the biblical text, and it's surrounded by layers of commentary, mostly from patristic authors, but also from later medieval authors that explain the text. These books recreate on the page, if you will, the medieval classroom, where the master would read out the biblical text and then proceed to explain it, either word by word or phrase by phrase, citing and talking about the tradition and how people traditionally explain the text. Gloss Bibles often spoken of in terms of the 12th century, and the text was created in the 12th century, were used, well, even beyond the 13th century, but were very commonly used in the 13th century. And they're often talked about as books of the classroom, which they were in origin, but they're also found extensively in many monastic libraries. The manuscripts in the Mmmonk corpus, the gloss Bibles, there's many examples, prove both points. There's many 13th century example, and of course, they came from monastic libraries. This is an example of Luke from the second quarter of the 13th century. How common overall were Bibles in the 12th century? Well, it's certainly not uncommon, particularly if you remember to include Bibles that don't include the complete scriptures. But just as a comparison, Routier, who has done, I cite her so often because she's done statistical studies. She's tried to identify, she's identified in a preliminary fashion 363 complete Bibles from the 11th and 12th centuries, much, much smaller than what the surviving numbers from the 13th century. Possibly not even enough for every monastery to have had a complete Bible, and certainly not at parish churches, and probably very few individuals. So, keeping that in mind, we're going to go back to the 13th century. The transition from the 12th century monastic Bible, owned and used corporately, often for the monastic liturgy, to 13th century Bibles, often very tiny, that were the quintessence of Bibles made for use by individuals, didn't happen all at once. In the second half of the 12th century, we begin to see examples of smaller format Bibles tailored for the use of particular individuals, often, but not always, within a monastery, especially like a book made for an abbot. There's only a handful of these examples, but they're very interesting. By the late 12th and early 13th century, however, continuing through the first 3 decades of the century, so circa 1200 to 1230, we see numerous one-volume Bibles produced and used outside the monastery. Many were copied in Paris, not all of them, but many, and are among the most important products of the rapidly growing new commercial book trade of that city. They vary in size. Many were very large books still, such as a substantial Bible copied in Paris around the beginning of the century, now in the British Library, additional 15253, that's 479 by 300 millimeters, kind of the same sizes that we were talking about with the grand 12th century monastic Bibles, and others are much smaller. There's one in the Bibliothèque Nationale, 15475, about the same date, that's only 268 by 180 millimeters. However, large outer dimensions in these books often mask an important innovation. Using smaller script and less space between the lines resulted in less space devoted to the text on the page, and saving lots of room for very wide margins, often used for copious notes, both formal and informal. There are many fewer Bibles of this type from the early decades of the 13th century than there are pocket Bibles and other Bibles for after circa 1230, but I have been trying to keep track of them, and I think I have a list of about 70 to 75 examples from across Europe, not all from Paris, and there's one right in Bruges, right here in Bruges. I can't wait to actually see it in person someday. It's quite a large book. 306 folios measuring 413 by 308 millimeters. Here we see the opening prologue with a very bold illuminated F. It has copied in 2 columns with 66 lines. So if you look at the page, at least in the reproduction, and it's quite faithful, you get the impression of the compressed written space and the wide margins. This is classic, as I said, for the new one-volume Bible of the first 30 years of the 13th century. I'm still trying to satisfy myself as to where it's made, so I'm not going to even guess, although it's certainly Northern Europe. The initials are very distinctive. They're by two artists. Here you see the one artist who works with these very geometric, blocky pink and blue initials, and then another one who works with sort of a softer palette. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it, but I'll keep working on it. Like many Bibles from this time period, it is a high-quality, professionally made book, and that's important. Dating is easier. It certainly dates from the first third of the 13th century. I don't think, well, maybe some of you have good enough eyes. Hard to see, but it's copied above the top line, and the script and initial style agree with that date. It includes a wonderful ex libris from Terdeurst, saying that it was from, meaning presumably a gift from, Dominus Franconus, the provost of St. Donatianus in Bruges. And I think it's likely the Bible was made for him. He's a known figure. He was Chancellor of Flanders from around 1231 to 1240. And so he was an important, wealthy person within the church, no doubt, and the type of person who would have owned a book like this. Note that its chapters continue older traditions. Here again with Genesis, these are the chapter lists, with it very nicely set out with red and blue initials at the beginning. But the text here and the text is divided into older chapters, but also modern chapters. And again, by modern chapters, I only mean the chapters that we still use today. If you look at this page from Hosea, the prophet, these little numbers in blue, the Roman numerals, this is marking a modern chapter. Here's 6, here's 7. Actually, my screen is very small. I may be reading the numbers wrong, like at the eye doctor. And the outer margin has the older chapter divisions. So you have both systems working at the same time. Many Bibles from this time period have two sets of chapters, and they were made for that. They were original to the book. The earliest instances of identifying citations from the Bible by book and chapter number, the way we do today all the time, as I mentioned before, begin in the 12th century. And the earliest examples use older chapters. But early in the 13th century, references to both modern chapters and older chapters are found in writings of Parisian theologians. From around 1225, references to modern chapters predominate and become quite common. As the practice of using chapters in this way to identify citations and conversely to find citations became more widespread, it was inevitable that one system replaced the many in circulation. And in Bibles copied after circa 1230, only modern chapters are typically the chapters you find in the book. So that's like, it's a great thing to track as you look at Bible manuscripts. And it had very important implications on use. What was this made for? Clearly study and preaching. There are tiny marginal notes throughout that signal topics, and many seem perfect for sermons. On this page from Hosea up here, it says, contra malos praelatus, against bad prelates. And here on the right, contra superbus, against prideful people. Perfect for someone looking for topics from the Bible to preach on. And wait till you see this next slide. This is one of my favorite from the whole talk. The ties with exegesis are even more obvious. In this Bible, one folio, so 2 pages, folio 159 recto verso, with the beginning of the Psalms, have been formally and extensively glossed. And then the glossing stops. So here's the page as a whole. Here's the detail that can show you how intricately this was put together. And then here's, apologies. Here's the next page. Many new one-volume Bibles from this time period include glosses, sometimes extensive enough to suggest that the intention was to take the glossa ordinaria. If you have a whole set of books of the glossa ordinaria for the whole Bible, it would take roughly 12 to 16 or even more volumes to cover the whole scriptures in that format. So the impression you get is what they're creating is a one-volume Bible that you can manipulate and study and work with that had all these exegetical comments included. I mean, it literally doesn't have the whole gloss, but you get the idea. They're compressing it down into one book. However, it's also not uncommon to find just a few pages glossed, suggesting that the makers of books like these had good intentions and they were going to put it all in, and it just took too long. It was too hard, so they stop. So, but I think it's fascinating. This Bible also has the interpretations of Hebrew names that we mentioned. This text is only added to Bibles uniformly after around 1230. This is an early example. I don't think it's original with the book, but it is pretty early. So it was added on a little bit later. So there's two texts at the beginning. I don't know why I keep on skipping ahead. At the very beginning of the book, in a less formal hand, but sort of contemporary, I think, is a list of the opening words of most of the chapters in the Bible according to modern chapters, which is fascinating, I think. This is the type of text that if you were a scribe copying a Bible from an exemplar that had older chapters and you wanted to update your book and put in the modern chapters, you would probably work with a text like this that listed for you where all the divisions go. It also includes a list of the lections for the Mass, so the epistle and gospel reading for the Mass. Again, the connection between liturgy and the Bible never goes away. It's a continuity through the centuries. These are not Cistercian use, but then that's not surprising because the book was a gift to the abbey. So this manuscript brings us back full circle, back to the book we started with, the new 13th century Bible, and especially the portable Bible. The pocket Bible, let's see if we can look at one as we talk. The pocket Bible was an international phenomenon copied across Europe. One of the earliest French Bibles, now in the Bibliothèque Municipale in Dole, manuscript 15, was copied in 1234. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that, but that's the earliest, not the earliest example, but the earliest dated example. This English pocket Bible here from now in Oxford was illuminated by the famous English artist from the period, William de Brailles, is datable between 1234 and 1240. So about roughly the same time. There are also examples from Spain and examples from Italy, again, slightly later in Southern Europe, but from the second quarter of the 13th century. One of the earliest documents that may be a reference to a pocket Bible is a list of books that bequeathed to the Abbey of Sant'Andrea in Vercelli by Cardinal Guala-Bicchiari, who died in May 1227. He owned 5 Bibles, which is pretty impressive, including a Bible that he says, in translation, a costly small Bible in Parisian script with gold letters and purple ornaments. It's an amazing statement. It's a Biblioteca Parva Pretiosissima de Littera Parisiensi. You could talk for a whole hour just about that. The new 13th century one-volume Bible, including portable Bibles, proved to be useful in many ways, from preaching to study to prayer. And this adaptability doubtless contributed to their astounding success. Complete in one volume and equipped with a system of chapters that from around 1230 was adopted widely and uniformly, these were books that could be searched and allowed for a variety of uses. Some of these were new. 13th century sermons, for instance, abound in strings of scriptural quotations, and these Bibles were perfect to find these citations that you needed. Exegetical use also continued. There are 13th century Bibles with their margins full of notes, including cross-references to other books of the Bible, using the new system of chapters for citations. If you have a portable or even a larger one-volume book, you can go back and forth and find things in the ways that would be very difficult in a massive 12th century monastic Bible. And finally, liturgical use was very important and continued. The de Brailles Bible that I still have on the screen includes both the text of the Bible and the text of a missal. And even though it's a very small book, whoops, here we go. And here is an example going back to the book from Paris that's now in the University Library in Ghent that we started with. This little book has evidence of liturgical use as well. At the beginning of Genesis, a later hand at the top here has added Dominica Prima in Septuagesima, that is the first Sunday in Septuagesima before Lent. And the readings are then marked in the margins with Arabic numerals. And you can see here's a 3 right here, trying to blow up the page. It would be very easy to go through this Bible and miss these numbers that are numbers for liturgical lections, but super important to look for them very carefully when you're going through a Bible. So I've like portable Bibles are such an interesting phenomena that we tend to talk about them a lot when we talk about 13th century Bibles, but it's equally important to remember that Bibles continue to be copied in large formats. Here's an example that is quite large, 377 by 242 millimeters. It's copied on the top line, probably from the early second quarter of the 13th century. And it includes marginal notes, which I think are evidence of exegetical use. The notes are in several different hands, with a more formal hand glossing at the beginning of the Genesis, Exodus, and Judges, and then other hands adding in comments as you go. So here's one example of sort of little comments there. You can see some of them are cut off, and I included that because it's good to keep your eyes out for things that you can't quite see anymore, but are just as important. And then finally, this more extensive glossing just appears once in the book. So one reader thought it important to add those notes. Another example from the public library in Bruges is I wanted to be sure to include it because most of the books we've looked at so far have been early or maybe second quarter, middle of the century, but Bibles continue to be copied through the 13th century. And this comes from much later in the century, probably the last quarter. It's another large Bible. And interestingly, for several reasons, there are holes in the parchment, indication that it's not copied on super high quality parchment. In a 12th century book or earlier, this is very common. But once you move into the 13th century, when people were buying commercially prepared parchment, it becomes much less common, except in books where it really indicates they couldn't afford more expensive parchment, if the distinction makes sense to you. And I wanted to show you, I mentioned that the Psalms usually don't have running titles and are not numbered, but everything you say about a manuscript, there are exceptions. This Bible, here's the running title, Psalterium, and the Psalms are carefully numbered and read. There's other examples of this too. And it's almost lacking of evidence of use until, I went page by page through this one on the digitized reproduction, looking for signs of use, and you find it right here in Obadiah, one of the minor prophets, and it has short and cryptic to me, I haven't figured out exactly what they're talking about, notes in the margin. Showing it here because sometimes you have to look really carefully, and if you get bored looking at all those folios of a Bible, you're going to miss important evidence. So to conclude, just for a couple minutes, I wanted to give you an example, give you a chance to look at one of the showpieces of the Mmmonk corpus. This is Le Grand Bible de Terre d'Ost, copied in Bruges around 1216, 1280. So art historians date it even more closely, 1265 to 1270. I'm sometimes a little skeptical about dates that close. 2 volumes, 2 illuminated volumes of this Bible now exist, illuminated by an artist known as the Dampierre master, and the illumination is just lovely. It's a nice big book. The volumes measure around 465 by 320 millimeters, and it was probably originally, originally 4 volumes. So here to give you a quick look at some of the gorgeous initials. I just love it. It's very beautiful. Uh, And then again, when you're going through, and this one, it's lots of pages to go through. I may have missed things, but on the basis of a preliminary look, there's not a lot of evidence. There's not a lot of marginalia. Most of it's very pristine looking. But again, looking closely, I hope you can see it. If you look at the name here, Reuben, and the name down here, Simeon, there are accent marks on the name. These are accents that I think were put in to facilitate liturgical reading. So when you're reading out loud, names are, I mean, like I probably have messed names up in this talk here. Names are always hard. And it was true in the Middle Ages as it's true now. So you can find pages in Bibles, if you look very carefully, where the words, sometimes more than just the names, have been marked up so that the lector during the liturgy will pronounce things correctly. And then I wanted to just throw out one more interesting comment about this book. It has said in some sources, and maybe Eveline, I'm sure she knows more about this book than I do. This is a volume now in the public library in Bruges. It's illustrated only with pen initials, no illumination. It's about the same size, probably not the same, about the same size, and it has sometimes been described as a third volume of this book. So it's possible they could have had money to illuminate part of it and then ran out of money. And this is very lovely, but it's nowhere near the fanciness as the other two volumes that we talked about. It is definitely copied by the same scribe, Henri, who describes himself as a conversus, and he copied, I think 9 books are known from him. So a prolific scribe, certainly working in Bruges. So there's his colophon in both different Bibles from this set. In conclusion, I wanted to first say that I hope this super quick summary gives you an idea of the richness of the manuscripts that are digitized in the Mmmonk corpus. It's a wonderful body of material, and certainly for Bibles. We have not talked about all the Bibles included, and there's lots more to be discovered and to be found out about them. I also want to say that I hope it's as an introduction to show you how the Bibles in the 13th century, why they're so important in the history of the Vulgate in Western Europe overall. The links with the modern Bible, I think, are surprising and interesting. As the first Bibles used by individuals, in the 13th century, a fairly narrow category of individuals consisting mainly of clerics and the very wealthy. But it's a category that will continue to grow throughout the later Middle Ages, the Reformation, and beyond into the modern era. So I think time is up. So thank you.